We are Kentucky, Tennessee living, and here we are at the West Tennessee Cotton Museum, located in West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center in Brownsville, Tennessee. Come along with us as we discover the tools that were used to create textiles not so long ago. Discover how cotton touches your family's everyday life. The most important part of the cotton plant is the lint or fiber used in making cotton textiles. Lint is used to make all kinds of clothing, from hats to shoes. Cotton has the strength and toughness for work clothes, but it can be spun into fine cloth for dressy gowns. Household goods made of cotton include rugs, towels, and bed sheets. Other cotton fiber products include book bindings, bandages, and auto seat fabrics. Cottonseed linters, which are the short fibers that cling to the seed, are used by many industries as chemically treated raw materials for such products as plastic, photographic film, paper, and sausage casings. Explosive manufacturers use linters to produce smokeless gunpowder. Linter fibers are also used to stuff mattresses, cushions, and pads. Linters that have been bleached and sterilized are used as a medical cotton. Information provided by the National Cottonseed Production Association. These baskets are from the Newman-Walpole Basket Collection, on loan from Newman-Walpole of Haywood County. The floor loom. The big, old-fashioned floor loom has a frame made of 4 upright pieces of timber. The 2 back posts are connected by a piece which the weaver calls the yard beam, and around this she winds what she calls the warp, or the lengthwise threads used for weaving. The 2 front posts are also connected by a piece of timber. This is the cloth beam, and around this the cloth will be wound as it is woven. After winding the thread on the yard beam, the weaver, quote, puts in the warp, unquote, passing each of the threads through a loop of cord or wire in the frame called a harness. If she is going to weave a piece of plain goods, she uses 2 harnesses. The off-warp thread passes through the eyes, or loops, of one, and the even threads pass through the eyes of the other. The weaver puts into a shuttle a quill on which is wound a thread, called a filling. This is to cross the warp. Now she is ready to weave. She perches herself on a rough seat, which is part of the loom, and begins her work. By a movement of her foot, the harness containing one set of threads is raised, and the other harness is lowered. Through the opening thus made, she passes the shuttle containing the filling. After this is passed through, it is pressed back against the warp. Then, by another motion of her foot, the lower set of threads is raised and the upper one is brought down. The second thread is put in and is pushed firmly into place. These operations are repeated until the desired length of the cloth is woven, usually a piece as long as the warp threads. In 1785, an English inventor named Edmund Cartwright developed the first power loom that would replace the old-fashioned hand loom. This was considered one of the greatest improvements in machinery for weaving during the Industrial Revolution. This hand loom, or floor loom, is from the Harvey Johnson estate of Lauderdale County, Tennessee, and on loan from Lauderdale County. The culture of quilt making in the Tennessee Delta. The culture of quilt making in the rural areas of the Tennessee Delta contributed to small farm stability before the industrialization affected the practice. North of Memphis and east of the Mississippi, quilt making thrived in the Tennessee Delta households of blacks and whites who worked on the cotton fields and under the pre-1960s conditions of labor-intensive agriculture. Quilts were valued not as examples of exacting, complex, and time-consuming needlework artistry, but as an affordable, much-needed source of warmth on winter nights. Quilt making was a way for the homemaker to take care of her family. Quilt making was a household necessity, homemaker's obligation, and a source of pride among the people who valued its self-sufficiency. They not only provided warmth, but brightened the home environment. The construction process gave hard-working homemakers time for pleasurable, creative activity, solitary relaxation, and companionship with quilt group friends. Quilt making reflected the living conditions and values of these small farm folk, while drawing from the 19th century quilt styles and from newspaper quilt patterns. Historically, textile work in this region was a realm where women of different age groups, economic groups, and racial groups interacted. Quote, she would get short patterned. Then she would put anything together and she'd say, it's a quilt, just as long as it would cover you up. Unquote. Opal Williams Brock, reflecting upon her mother-in-law when she would quilt. Quote, just all kinds of junk. The quilt wasn't worth me trying to get that little bitty dainty pattern to go all around that and quilt that. Unquote. Lucille Steele Height, describing the labor-intensive detail work that goes into making fancy quilts. Quote, it was a duty, and if you didn't have quilts for your family for the winter to keep warm, then it was an equivalent to leaving your dishes unwashed or the floors not swept. Unquote. Carolyn Simpson. The culture of quilt making in the Tennessee Delta, Board Number 2. Quilting techniques were developed over decades and shared informally. Younger women learned to make quilts by watching and working with the older family members and neighbors. Men contributed to quilt making by building frames and storage boxes, buying sewing machines and supplies, and bringing clean cotton home from the gin to serve as batting. Quilt frames were homemade and could be used outdoors, or raised or lowered from ceilings in rooms that were also needed for eating and sleeping. Even without a frame, women could quilt or tie a quilt, laying it over a bed, table, or lap. Several developments encouraged quilt making among the small farm women of the late 1800s. One was the great increase in quantity, variety, and affordability of factory-made cotton cloth in attractive multicolored prints. This cloth was easier to cut and sew than was the hand-woven cloth. Quilt makers minimize cash outlay through ready-to-access to cotton, used for quilting and batting, and reliance on recycled materials such as commodity sacks, sewing scraps, and salvaged parts of old clothes for use in quilt tops and backings. As agriculture mechanized, rural workers switched to factory jobs and could afford nicer homes and blankets. Old quilts were used as pallets for children to sleep on, or used to define a safe play area for small children when spread on the floor, in the yard under a tree, or at the end of a cotton row. Some people used quilts for padding in the back of a wagon or truck. Some used worn-out quilts as batting for new ones. Some uses of quilts were expressive. They made the surfaces of beds pretty, were hung over furniture, or to make tents for children to play. They gave a sense of comfort and security, and they made people smile as they recognized a family member's clothing in a pattern piece. Quilt making has survived because women, both black and white, reinvented it as a hobby that met personal and social needs. Quote, "Whatever we was wearin' that was too old, she would cut up and make quilts out of it. You didn't throw away nothin'. If you had a old pair of blue jeans, they was cut up and put in a quilt. If you had a dress or something that was cut up, if you had a flour sack, that was cut up." Unquote. Ollie Moore. The Rural Economics of Sewing. This 1947 Singer sewing machine belonged to Mildred Clark, University of Tennessee Extension Service home agent. She was assigned to Haywood County to provide home economics education programs from 1964 to 1972. Clark was the integral part of the UT Extension Plan. The plan created workshops to educate local citizens about more affordable techniques to use on the farm and at home. Part of this initiative included teaching women basic and advanced skills concerning textiles and clothing. In 1965, Haywood County saw a growing need in their community for homemakers and 4-H girls to learn how to sew. This was especially important for low-income families who could not afford the rising cost of clothing. To address the problem, Haywood County set up multiple workshops throughout the area. Some topics included advanced dress construction, 4-H clothing construction, use of simple construction, and tailoring workshops. In the sewing machine workshops, some of the machines were up to 100 years old, and many had not been used for several years. While cleaning one of them, one woman found a mouse skeleton in the head of the machine, which, quote, "created quite a bit of excitement," unquote. Attendees of these workshops learned how to make clothes for their families. Others, such as the members of the Dancyville Home Demonstration Club, used their sewing skills to make clothes for the patients at the Arlington Hospital. Because of their physical disabilities, patients needed specially made clothing. These workshops were very successful. According to the 1972 July Progress Report, roughly 300 homemakers were taught advanced sewing skills, while 45 homemakers learned basic patterns. In the advanced classes, over 3,000 accessories were made, such as men's ties, women's scarves, and macrame items, which resulted in an estimated savings of $9,000. Additionally, 300 suits were made with an estimated savings of $6,000. This concludes our section of the West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center's Cotton Museum walk through how cotton was turned into textiles. Stay tuned as we will cover the growth of the cotton industry into what it is today. We thank you for watching Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of Kentucky and Tennessee and how they helped to shape American history.